Hello, everybody, and either welcome or welcome back to the Gender Libertarian Podcast. If you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and Libertarian Institute. So, obviously, this episode is going to be about the infamous 1619 Project, as I promised I would do the last episode. If you don't know what the 1619 Project is, it's a project that the New York Times is doing, and they released it not this past weekend, but the weekend before that, at least the first kind of installment of it. From what I understand, this is supposed to be an ongoing project where there'll be more pieces added to it later. But the overarching idea of it is 1619 is the first time that an African was brought to what became the United States, because obviously we weren't the United States in 1619, which a lot of people have wanted to be pedantic about that, but it's like, it really doesn't matter. Like, you're kind of missing the point if you want to point out that we weren't America in 1619. But anyway, that was the first time that that an African was brought here, and from what I understand, they were actually an indentured servant, which indentured servants were kind of the precursors to slaves. Basically, you were brought here, and a lot of English people, a lot of Irish people did this. You basically promised yourself to a landowner, like a farmer, whatever, that you would work for them for X amount of time, and then once X amount of time was done, you were a free man. And that's how that started, and then they eventually moved to full-on slavery. But the 1619 Project is explicitly supposed to be kind of framing the history and basically everything that happened in the United States as being the result of slavery. Like, that basically everything that the U.S. has and has ever made or stood for was the result of slavery. So, my biases going into reading this, because I did read most of it. I did not read all the essays, because some of them are really long and some of them are just like, kind of make you want to stab yourself in the temple with a rusty butter knife. But here's my thing. And a lot of people came at this with a very negative kind of mindset and opinion, which is completely justified. I mean, if you're presenting your project as everything in this country is about slavery, and so slavery is bad, and so then by definition the U.S. is bad, obviously that's going to piss off a lot of people, and it did piss off a lot of people. And especially leading with that, and then the first two essays in the project, like, a lot of people stopped right there and were really, really pissed with really, really good reason. But my feeling when I first heard about this is, as a Southerner, we see these sorts of things crop up from time to time where somebody wants to have a discussion about slavery. And it always ends up becoming this thing where the South is just the evil, evil boogeyman, and the North was just presented as this absolutely post-racial utopian rainbows and unicorns places, which L-O fucking L. It is not post-racial now, let alone was it then. But that's always how these things seem to get framed up, is that South bad, North good, and let's all shit on the South. So that's what I thought going into this. I'm like, oh God, here we go with this bullshit again. And to be fair, like, there's a lot that is said about the North in this too. So I was pleasantly surprised on that level. Another thing that kind of always annoys me, and probably most other Southerners when these sorts of things crop up, is this idea that people outside the South seem to have that we are not aware that slavery happened or that the Civil War happened, and that for some reason people seem to think that they need to keep reminding us of it, which you don't. We know. We're working on it in our own way. Please leave us be. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. But it always seems to come down that way. It's where, like, people seem to think that they need to remind the South that, hey, remember, you guys had slavery. It's like, no shit, Sherlock. Thanks. We got this. And it was something I was thinking about when I was doing the notes for this and reading the 1619 Project, and just kind of how steeped in culture the Civil War is here, and our history and our legacy in the South is that I live in Georgia, I live in Atlanta, and there's these little, like, decorative green signs that you see kind of here, there, and everywhere. And they're so prevalent that they kind of fade into the background. But what they are is they're these little markers of battles that happened during the Civil War, or skirmishes, or these people died here, or this is the path that people took to get over there. And like I said, they're so prevalent that once you're here long enough that they just kind of like fade into the background and you don't really notice them. And I mean, I have one like less than a mile away from my apartment complex. And it's this weird reminder that you live someplace that was once a war zone, but you live in the United States. So it's like this, it's always there for us. Like it's always here. Like we have Stone Mountain in Lithonia. It's the Confederate Mount Rushmore. It's bigger than Mount Rushmore, dedicated to Confederate generals. And in fact, if you go to Stone Mountain Park, there is actually a section of the park, and I need to go back because it's been a while since I've been there, but they actually have set up an actual, honest to God, plantation house. Like not like a reproduction, but they actually like found a plantation house and brought it there, and they set up kind of what your average farm situation would look like, including slave cabins. So like you can go there and see like actual slave cabins. Like they're not reproductions of slave cabins. They're actual slave cabins that they found in various parts of the state, and they imported them into this exhibit. And the point of the exhibit is to highlight how slaves lived before the Civil War, before the abolition of slavery. And so you can go there and you can see this. And it's like anybody can go. And it's not like a secret, although I have seen some people. I see this come up time to time, and they never mention like the actual exhibit. I always assume they're talking about the plantation exhibit at Stone Mountain. But like white people that'll go there and then get all pissed off when they realize that it's really not about like the plantation owners, it's really about the slaves. Like the whole point of the exhibit is to show how slaves lived, and getting all pissed off about it. And it's kind of hilarious. But I told you all that to kind of set up this sort of idea that for me, at least, and for most Southerners, this conversation is not a new conversation. This is something that's been going on openly for decades and decades and decades. The idea of talking about race and race relations and just the impact that slavery had and everything that came after that. Like everything as far as like the Jim Crow laws, the redlining, just general attitudes towards race in general. Like these aren't really new conversations in the South. So that was my personal biases going into this. Before we get into talking about certain pieces, I do want to kind of give two critiques off the bat of the project in general. And the first one is that it seems to buy into this idea of like original sin theory, basically, like in religion, where you believe that all mankind is fundamentally flawed, it's fundamentally evil because of what happened in the Garden of Eden, and that there's no getting past that. Like, that's it. Like, there's nothing you can do to get past that. And it's like that theory being applied to slavery in the United States by basically saying that slavery was our original sin and that there's no atoning for it. Like, there's no way of getting past it. So my feeling on that is if that is your attitude, then the same way I view it in religion, view like original sin in religion, is then why bother trying? Like, if you cannot make it past this one thing, like if there's just this one roadblock and there's nothing you can do to get past it, then why try to do better and be better? Because you're never going to be able to be absolved of that one sin, you know? Like, it's a very reductivist way of looking at things, and I don't think it's very helpful in this particular situation or in any situation. And then the second thing is the idea, this very modern idea, and it's one that I've pushed back on in different areas, especially, I know I've done it a lot, when people try to explain like how Trump got elected and they point to one thing and they say this one thing is the thing. There is no way of explaining a huge phenomena as being the result of one thing. And that is what this is trying to do, like basically saying that the U.S. exists because of slavery. Well, there's no way that anybody can parse this experiment of the United States of America, this political and social experiment that we have here, as being the result of one thing. It's way too big and way too complicated to say that it's about one thing. And like I said, it's this very, very modern, very reductivist way of trying to explain things that are very big and messy and complicated and trying to put it into this one tiny little box so that you can feel better about it. And it's just like, it's not that simple. Nothing is ever that simple. And then the idea that the U.S. is successful because of slavery and that's it, well then you're going to need to explain to me why there aren't a bunch of other Americas, because we were not the only country that engaged in slavery. Not saying that slavery was a great thing anywhere. Nobody should have done it. People are not property. And certain slaves were treated horrifically. And the fallout from slavery has been pretty horrific too. But if you're going to say that slavery is it, that is the one reason that the U.S. has been as successful as it is, well then it should have been very easy for other countries to replicate our success, and it should be very easy for other countries to replicate our success. All you would have to do is have slaves, right? Like, that would be the easiest thing for a country to do, and then voila, you're the next America. Clearly, that did not and has not happened and is not going to happen. I mean, Libya is not becoming the next America. So it's a dumb kind of thing to try to reduce it to on its face, because I mean, there's the obvious argument. Like, if you're going to say it was all about one thing, then it should be easily replicatable. And we've seen ever since the establishment of the United States and everything going forward that nobody else has really done what we've done. And I do call it a political experiment because it is still an experiment in process. And it's one that hasn't been able to be fully replicated anywhere else. So it can't be about just one thing. There has to have been a lot of different things that come together to make America what it is today. So, anyway, moving on from my general critiques and biases and thoughts going into this and discussing a few of the pieces in the 1619 Project. I'm going to start with the two most controversial pieces, and I'm not going to do deep dives into any of these pieces really, except for the exception of maybe one, but the two pieces that kind of start off this project. The first one says point blank that the reason the United States wanted to secede from Britain was over slavery. Period. Like, that was, as according to this piece, that was the main reason why we did it. Which, everybody knows that's not why we did it. And that's not to say that it wasn't a discussion, especially when framing the Constitution. The topic of slavery was a very, very hotly contested topic. It was not the reason we decided to leave England, though. We didn't throw all that tea into the harbor over slaves. It was over taxation without representation. Everybody knows this. So it's just this weird trying to reframe history and very revisionist history. And this one really pissed off a lot of people. Like, this is the one that I think really set off the powder keg of criticisms of the whole 1619 Project in general. Is people read this piece and then the second piece and they were like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm out. I'm not reading any of the rest of this. This is bullshit. It's dumb. I'm not even engaging with this. But I read a little bit further. I did not read everything. I'll be honest. I did not read all of it. But I did find a couple pieces that were good, but I wanted to start off with that because it's such a crazy assertion to make. Like I said, it was discussed, and at the time when we were seceding from Britain, Britain was talking about abolishing slavery. They didn't do it till it was some 50-odd years after we had seceded from Britain. So it wasn't something that was super pressing for Britain either. It's not like something that they were going to do like in the next 6 months. And we were just like, oh my God, we love slavery. We have to get away from you people. That's not how it went down. And there's also this attitude that I see kind of in this piece. And I see it a lot when people from the left kind of talk about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, is there seems to be this idea that all of them were these rich white slave owners who were all in agreement on slavery, which, like I said, was absolutely not the case. First of all, they didn't all own slaves. The northern delegates were very much against slavery. The southern delegates were for it. It was very hotly contested, and obviously things panned out the way they did. It wasn't outlawed in the Constitution. It wasn't outlawed until after the Civil War, which we ended up going to war over it, so obviously there wasn't like a massive consensus on this. We actually had a civil war over the concept of slavery and states' rights and whether people can secede or not secede. So obviously not a matter of settled opinion amongst these men or the country in general. So again, it's one of those revisionist history things where people like for history to be a certain way, and it ignores the actual facts of how this country came to be founded, came to be, and it's something that requires pushback, because rewriting history is shitty. Like, our history is messy enough. We don't need to make it any more messy. And there also seems to be this attitude that the founding fathers didn't understand the inherent contradiction of what they were saying as far as all men being created equal and life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and slavery. Again, that was something that was discussed a lot, deeply, hotly contested. They understood the contradiction was there. They weren't ignorant to the contradiction. They just didn't have any way that they could figure out to solve it in that particular moment, and the Constitution needed to get written. And I mean, there is a little bit of that political gamesmanship too, where you got to give people kind of a little bit of what they want to get them to the table. And for this particular purpose, slavery was the thing. Not saying it was right, not saying it was good, not saying that it shouldn't have been abolished off the rip in the original Constitution, but it wasn't. And it's not that everybody agreed on the topic. So, moving on from that piece to the second piece. And that is the piece that floats the idea that modern capitalism started with slavery. And the examples they use are rather interesting. Basically, the idea that, well, on plantations, you had accounting and bookkeeping, and you had like productivity reports and profit and loss statements. That wasn't invented on the plantation, people. That's something that's happened ever since people started buying and selling things or trading things with each other. You have to have a way to keep track of what you have, what you don't have. If you're selling things for a profit, you need to be able to make sure that you're making a profit. But over that, I have always viewed slavery as this very bizarre mashup between feudalism and capitalism. Obviously, it's capitalism in the way that you're purchasing a person, and I don't want to minimize that. You're purchasing a person to come work on your land. But what ended up happening is this very feudal idea that once you're there, like you're there until if your plantation owner sells you or you die, but then also your children are bound to that land too, and their children. Kind of the same way it worked under feudalism, where if you were a serf and you worked for a specific house, whatever, you were there for life, and then your kids were there, and your grandkids, and your great-grandkids, and your family just lived there for freaking ever until something happened. So, it's never been, in my view, a completely capitalist way of handling things. And there have been critiques of this particular piece and this particular idea that do point out that the usage of slaves likely held back the South as far as innovating new ways to meet the new demands of just what was being demanded of the farms and plantations in the South. And they touch on the fact that once the cotton gin was invented, demand for cotton skyrocketed. And so with slavery, what they did was they just bought more slaves and then started keeping track of productivity. Whereas if that did not exist, they would have had to come up with a new way to meet that demand. They would have had to innovate some other way of picking more cotton other than just having more people. And in that way, it kind of retarded progress in the South, which I think is a fairly valid critique and explanation. So there is that. But even in that piece, though, there is still some knowledgeable stuff and still some things that I don't think a lot of people know. And one of the points that they point out in that piece is that because slaves were property, that they could also be used as collateral for loans. And that's a thing that happened too. And that's a thing that's worth pointing out because a lot of people probably don't know that. Although logically, if you think about it in your head, like property is property and you can use property as collateral the same way you can today. But people were used as collateral for loans. And that's fucked up. And that's worth talking about. But there's more pieces like that. And then there's another piece too that even manages to try to blame like our current hyper-partisan political situation on slavery somehow. It was very confusing to me. It just like, when you're trying to make this very long stretch of a reach where you're reaching past like 20 other reasons why a thing exists to try to get to this one thing way over there and make it be about this one thing way over there, it's like, you're trying too hard. There's probably a dozen different reasons I can come up with off the top of my head for why politics is the way it is today. I mean, it has to do with tribalism. It has to do with buying into people's fears. It has to do with just demonizing other people. It doesn't have anything to do with slavery, though. Like, I don't really know how you make that connect. But God bless, they tried. They really tried. And I think leading off with all of that really turned most people off to trying to dig any deeper into any of the other pieces. But there was actually, once you get past those pieces, once you get past those first like 3, especially the first 2, make it past the 3rd, then you actually start getting to some pieces that are interesting. Like, honestly, genuinely interesting. Like the next one in the series touches on race and healthcare, and not like insurance type healthcare, but like actual like physical healthcare, and how even to this day we still have to deal with race science, which that is still a conversation that is going on, and that has roots that stretch all the way back to slavery. And kind of the justification that a lot of people had for slavery is viewing blacks as others. And a lot of the attitudes that were displayed towards blacks, even back then in the North and in the South, let's not mince words here, still persist to this day. Like, there are still kids going through medical school who think that black people have a higher pain tolerance than white people. There are still people going through med school that think black people have thicker skin than white people. And all of these kinds of ideas originate from experiments that were done to black people during slavery under these sorts of these ideas that you could do these experiments on black people because A, they're not really people, and B, you have all these pseudoscience sorts of things where people thought, oh, well, black people are just inherently stupider than white people, and black people were physiologically different. And so it wasn't such a big deal to do these horrific, barbaric experiments on black people because who cares? They're fine, and they have a higher pain tolerance anyway, so they'll be fine. It doesn't matter. They can just do all kinds of shit to them. Who gives a shit? Because they'll be fine. They're too stupid to know any better anyway. And so these are ideas that still persist to this day. And that is worth talking about. And that is worth kind of unpacking and exploring and trying to get better and fixing that. And so there's, like I said, there is good stuff in this project and things that are worth discussing, but everybody kind of stops at like the bullshit and doesn't dig any deeper. And before I go any further and talk about the pieces that I did really enjoy, the one thing that really did make me happy about this project overall is that the North didn't get the whitewash treatment that it usually gets whenever people want to talk about slavery. Because the North was just as complicit in the slave trade as the South was. And in fact, there were plenty of families in the North, especially in New York and Boston, which, dirty secret, That's where most of the companies that owned the slave boats were based out of, and that's where most of the slave boats docked, because in the South, there weren't really any ports large enough to accommodate these ships, so they came in through New York and Boston, and then from there, the slaves were transported down to the South, or you went up north and then you bought the slaves and you brought them down here. And so there were plenty of pro-slavery people in the North, and plenty of people making a lot of money off of slavery in the North. And this project doesn't gloss over that fact. And for that, I am appreciative. Because that's another thing, that if we're going to have this conversation about slavery, we need to have a conversation about how this wasn't just, oh, these dumbasses down in the South who bought people. Like, okay, well, somebody sold them those people. And the people that sold them those people lived in the North, and that's worth talking about, and that's worth calling people out on too. So for that, I was happy. And it is something that runs through a lot of these pieces, where the North is called to task for their part in the slave trade too. And that makes me happy. Because honesty, people, just intellectual honesty is usually all I ask of anything. And so, yeah, that made me happy. But to highlight two pieces that I really did genuinely enjoy, the first one, and this is a total Homer thing, I admit, but Kevin Cruse's article about Atlanta and about traffic in Atlanta, pointing to two things that definitely contribute to the problem. I'm not going to say that they're completely the problem, but they definitely attribute to it. And that is the fallout from redlining, which obviously redlining is no longer legal. If you don't know what redlining is, basically there used to be actual laws in place where it said that if you were X ethnicity, you cannot get a mortgage, get a loan, anything for any property above this line. And so you ended up with segregated neighborhoods. So even after the practice of redlining is outlawed, you still have these segregated neighborhoods, and it's something that Atlanta still deals with to this day. And I can attest to the fact that your address in Atlanta does have social connotations. Like, do you live inside the perimeter or outside the perimeter? Or even more importantly, do you live north of I-20 or south of I-20? Because I-20 was kind of the line. Like, north of I-20 is where the white people lived, and south of I-20 is where the black people lived. And it still is that way to a large extent. And I mean, obviously there has been people moving back and forth across I-20, obviously. It's not completely segregated in Atlanta, obviously. But you still have those remnants of redlining. And the second thing that Cruz talks about is MARTA. And the reason why our public transportation sucks so bad in Atlanta is due in a good part to racism, to places that have pushed back, like tooth and nail have fought MARTA expanding into their neighborhoods. Cobb County, I'm looking at you. But even to this day, you have cities, you have counties that point blank do not want MARTA anywhere near them because they don't want the people who ride MARTA to have access to their neighborhoods. And by the people who ride MARTA, they mean the lower income black and brown people. And everybody in Atlanta knows this. Like, it's not a secret. Like I said, we know where we fucked up. But it is this thing. And I'm not going to say that that's the only reason why MARTA sucks. MARTA has its own problems. They're very good at making money disappear when they get money and not really having anything to show for it. But there is a reason why we can find money to fund this stupid fucking trolley car that goes in a circle and doesn't service anybody, but we can't get more trains that actually go places that would be helpful to more people in the city. And because of these attitudes, everybody in the city suffers. Like, our traffic sucks due to large part that we have shitty public transportation. And so in Atlanta, you have to have a car. Like, it's very hard to get around just based on MARTA alone because it's not very functional. And it's not very functional because there are people that don't want it around them. And it's stupid. It's stupid and it's dumb, but it exists. And this essay I like because I feel like this is a good example of what this project could have been off the rip and maybe could be in the future. And that is discussing the fallout from slavery, which led to Jim Crow laws down here, which also led to segregation, also led to the redlining, led to all of these horrible policies that even though they don't exist anymore, the negative impacts of these policies still exist, and a lot of these attitudes still exist, and that is something that should be discussed and unpacked. I feel like that's where this project should be. Like, that, I think, is way, way more beneficial than trying to say that this country was founded on slavery and everything is about slavery, or trying to say that capitalism invented slavery, or that the whole reason we seceded from Britain was over slavery. Like, that's dumb shit. This Kevin Krus's piece is smart shit because it's real, like, it's legitimate. And that is a place where you can have that discussion about race and about the effects of racist policies that existed, and we still have to deal with the fallout. Like, we still have to have these discussions. We still have to get past these certain attitudes and these certain situations that were created by these policies that don't exist anymore. The other essay that I really liked in this project was Wesley Morris's essay on basically how Black music became integrated into white culture and why kind of other ethnicities, other races have adopted Black music, or what we refer to as Black music, as part of their own culture. And it really does this nice, wonderful deep dive. It really is an interesting read into how essentially the first time Black music was introduced to white crowds was for Northerners who obviously did not have the exposure to Black people that Southerners had. They started doing the minstrel shows. They had the blackface, and Northerners loved it. They loved it. It became huge. Minstrel shows were like just the most insanely popular thing. Blackface performers became superstars, and predominantly they were white, obviously. White people putting on blackface, and the very exaggerated blackface. I'm sure you've seen it at some point. You know, the very dark skin and the very red lips. And then they do these very exaggerated sorts of accents and just facial expressions and body expressions. And then they do what they considered Black music. Although, like I said, not a lot of them actually had any exposure to actual Black people. So, but it became huge, and the white people loved it. They absolutely loved it. And there's one part in there that points out kind of the absurdity of that situation, which was that it was perfectly fine for white people to put on blackface and then to go perform in blackface for white people, but you couldn't put just a Black person on stage. That would have been considered, like, offensive. So there was one story in there where one of the minstrel show producers had to sub in an actual Black person because their minstrel performer was sick, and the person that they were subbing in was a Black person. What he had to do was not just put a Black person on stage, because that would have been like that would have been like so far beyond the pale that people probably would have just like left. He had to put blackface on a Black person, which is dumb when you think about it. But the idea of taking a Black person and putting black paint on their face and then putting the red lipstick on and then putting the Black person on stage with blackface on is pretty fucked up. But that's where the exposure to Black music and Black culture started for white people. And the piece traces through that kind of really messed up beginning where you had white people performing in blackface and pretending to be Black people, which eventually led to actual Black people being allowed on stage and white people enjoying the Black people's music. And then that led to people realizing that this Black music was commercially viable, that there was a market for it, which then led to the Motown juggernaut, which then led to all of a sudden all these white kids buying these albums by Black performers. And then through that, all of a sudden, white performers starting to connect with that sound and with that kind of image and starting to adopt it into their own music. And then through that way, kind of white music and black music became kind of intermeshed and kind of desegregated to a point where now you do have white performers performing black music, and it's fairly common. I'm like, and it ends actually on Old Town Road, the Lil Nas X song, where you got Lil Nas X, who's from Atlanta. He's a rapper, although his music, obviously, it started where the song before Billy Ray Cyrus even did his bit on it. It was originally released into the Billboard country charts. And Billboard decided that this isn't country music. So it got kind of pushed over to the pop charts, and then it blew up, and then Billy Ray Cyrus, who's obviously Billy Ray Cyrus, everybody knows who he is, he did his verse on it, and then the song became freaking huge. And it's just this example of just different musical genres, one typically considered black and one typically considered white, merging together and people just losing their shit over it. And so, like, even today, this is still a thing. And it's just, again, it's another example of what this whole project could be if people stop trying to make it be about dumb shit. Like, there's actual, like, it's an actually kind of uplifting piece. Like, it's a rather positive piece. And again, that's another discussion that we can have as far as how exactly, culturally speaking, whites and blacks became integrated. Like, we know how they became integrated legally, like segregation was made illegal, but just because you make something illegal doesn't all of a sudden mean that society just like, poof, okay, we're totally cool with integration now. Like, it takes time. And that a way to do that is through things like music or like movies or just cultural things like that show different cultures, how other cultures work. And you integrate in that way. So that was another piece that I really, really liked. But to kind of wrap up that and give my overall thoughts on the project and then kind of move to more of the reactions to the project, I feel like New York Times really did itself a disservice with the way they framed this up and with leading with those two essays. Because like I said, all of that really turned a lot of people off and automatically put people in this very negative space where you're not going to read past those first two essays. You're just going to just trash it and not read further on where there are decent pieces and decent discussions that could be had from those pieces. So I don't know why they pursued this the way they did. I mean, people have said that it's a SJW thing or that it's trying to lead to some kind of conversation about reparations, this, that, and the other. But as far as it being like a standalone project that you want people to be excited about and interested in, they really screwed up. Like, there's really no other way to put it. Like, you really, really fucked up in launching this whole project. And I hope that maybe more people do read further into it, and hopefully in the future, different pieces that they put into the project are more in the vein of the kind of the later pieces that are in the project as it stands right now, and not like the first two pieces, because those are just garbage. And then it really turned a lot of people off. So, on the reactions. Okay. Obviously, conservatives and libertarians reacted a certain way to this project. If you've been online, if you've been on social media, I'm sure you've seen how people have reacted, and there have been plenty of think pieces written about the project in general and about specific pieces, and there have been pieces arguing about the economics of slavery and doing more deep dives on that, and doing deep dives on the topic of revisionist history. So there's been a lot done in that vein, and I'm kind of glossing over it because it's a little beyond the scope of what I want to talk about. But if you go look out there, you'll find it where people have done more intensive deep dives on these pieces than I have done. But a lot of people kind of, like I said, they kind of dismissed this off the rip without giving it a chance. And this always kind of comes up when these sorts of topics become trending. And that is this idea that libertarians don't like to talk about racism, and that is a blind spot in libertarianism. Now, I can only speak for myself, and so I am only going to speak for myself. I personally have no problems talking about race and racism. However, I very sparingly use the word racism, and there's a reason for that. I think part of the reason why so many people reacted negatively to this off the rip was that the idea of racism and the meaning of the word has been bastardized to the point where, like, everybody wants to call everybody a racist now. It becomes this stupid, empty word almost that people throw around, and I think a lot of people kind of came at this at that sort of mindset of, oh, okay, this is just another bunch of leftists calling everybody racist again because that's what they do. And admittedly, yes, that is what they do. Like, there are people that just say, everybody I don't like is a racist, everybody I don't like is a Nazi, yada, yada, yada. But the reason why I try to be so precise when I use terms like that is because words do matter. And racism still exists. And this is a thing that I've seen people say about libertarians, and like I said, I can't speak on it, but apparently there are libertarians who think that this whole conversation is stupid and that racism doesn't exist, I guess, which I don't even know how the hell anybody can make that argument. Of course racism still exists. I mean, look at our criminal justice system. Look at all the shit that we have to deal just in that section alone. Like, if racism didn't exist, if we lived in a post-racial society, so many problems with just that portion of our country alone would be solved. But obviously, it still exists. I don't understand wanting to ignore the fact that it exists, and the reason why I highlighted the pieces that I highlighted, aside from genuinely liking them, is that there is a conversation to still be had about the fact that racism exists in this culture, and even if you don't agree with it and you don't think it should exist, which of course I happen to think that too. Obviously, I abhor racism. I don't think it should exist. Obviously, racism is not at all compatible with individualism or libertarianism. That being said, we are not the majority, and I wish I had the power to make everybody think the way we do. As what I try to do with this, I try to get this message out to more people so that maybe more people will start to think the way we do and will start to view things and people as individuals and not as races or genders or sexual identifications or any of these sort of identity-based sorts of labels that we place on people. But obviously other people do feel this way, and other people do have these attitudes. And to ignore that, I think, is stupid. And it's not to say that every conversation about racism has to be like some kind of, oh, it's SJW virtue signaling and you're just trying to appeal to this person and that person. It's like, no. There are things that genuinely need to be discussed. There are attitudes in this country that are racist. Just like saying that there's attitudes in this country that are sexist. I mean, that's a fact. And to ignore it is stupid to me. And to try to denigrate all conversations about these sorts of things as trying to posture or to appeal to leftists is stupid to me too, to be completely honest. Because, as I pointed out, there are things to discuss. There are things to be said. And I'm not a fan of anybody who tries to just completely shut down any conversation by sticking their head in the sand and pretending like a thing doesn't exist when it very clearly does exist. So, for what it's worth, I am a libertarian who will happily talk to you about racism or race relations whenever you'd like. I'm here. You can find me on Twitter. We can have these conversations. I think another thing that I thought about that I wanted to bring up about being a Southerner. I see this kind of go down sometimes where it's taboo in certain sections of the country to have these conversations. And it's an attitude that I personally have never understood because, like I said, I was born and raised in the South. Like, this has been a conversation my whole life. Like, having these sorts of conversations is not considered weird or odd or awkward or something that you need to shut down. It's been something that's been encouraged my whole life. So I understand that for some people who did not grow up in the atmosphere that I grew up in, that having these conversations might be a little awkward because you've been trained socially to be like, oh, we don't talk about that in public. Well, maybe it's time to start talking about it in public. And maybe it's time to start getting over being awkward or weird about certain topics that are incendiary, so that maybe we can get past this shit, and maybe one day we can be a post-racial society, and one day everybody can view everybody as an individual and not as a skin color, and to get rid of some of these attitudes that people have that because somebody's skin color is a certain color that they are XYZ. Like, the only way we're going to get past any of this shit is to talk it out. So I am here for the conversation. If anybody else wants to be too, that's fine. And if you are somebody who feels a little awkward about having these conversations, well, that's fine too. But try to figure out some kind of way to get past that a little bit, because it's really not as scary a topic as you think. And again, this may be me and my Southern privilege talking, but it's not that scary a topic. So, on that note, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because this has already gone longer than I planned for it to. So, as always, if you did make it this far, thank you. And if you do like this, please rate, comment, and subscribe. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and Libertarian Institute. Take care, and until next time.